Ladies and gentlemen, we are cadets from the United States Military Academy. I'm Cadet Oman. This is Cadet James. These are Cadets Molinar and Powers. We're going to be talking about moral injury and PTSD in our platoon. I'm very excited to be here. Hope you enjoy the presentation.
So first, we'd like to talk about the ethical dimensions of moral injury and how we plan on defining and using this concept throughout our presentation. So first, we'd like to define moral injury as some sort of psycho or emotional pain that a soldier, sailor, airman, or marine is experiencing due to some tragic event that they were involved in. So this tragic event, they could have done something, they could have failed to do something, or they could have just been involved in something some way. And this tragic event really conflicted with their deeply held moral beliefs and questioned their expectations on personal goodness. And because of this, they experienced some sort of cognitive dissonance in their ideas of their personal concepts before deployment and after deployment. So an important assumption that we want to make in this presentation is that when we're talking about how we want to address moral injury and PTSD in our service members, we want to make the assumption that these are service members that did their best to fulfill the rules of engagement and the laws of war that we as our platoon and the military in general have set. And we're going to be using lots of different ethical frameworks throughout the presentation because we really feel that it's a multidimensional concept of ethics. So we're going to be talking about both normative or act-based frameworks and also about virtue-based frameworks. So there are some concerns and benefits of really talking about this concept of moral injury and trying to implement ways to address it. One of the benefits that we see coming out of these discussions on moral injury are really addressing these issues with a community-based perspective. So we want to take moral injury and PTSD completely, not completely in the hands of the medical community and upon this individual themselves to reform themselves, but we also want to bring it into the community at large and the family to answer some of these underlying moral questions we have about war. And this is also important so the responsibility isn't just on this individual to deal with how they feel, but also on everyone to support our service members. Some potential risks that we see in ethics are first, moral relativism. So this is the concept that it's sometimes difficult for us to say that anyone can be morally injured because sometimes we question the frameworks that they're using on making a moral judgment. But at the same time, it's really difficult for us to tell someone that one moral framework is the best way to make their decisions. Another concern that we have about this is the idea of revising what we think about just warfare theory. So these questions that we're developing when we're having these discussions on moral injury may bring us up to some revisionist perspectives on just warfare theory. And then a final concern we have is this idea that if these individuals are experiencing moral injury because of a lack of moral control they have over a situation, maybe because they're more likely to experience moral bad luck and just be in those situations of bad luck, it's kind of difficult to say that they have much autonomy in controlling what happens. So we're going to have to take this into perspective when we're addressing how we can prevent moral injury. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Cadet Powers to discuss how moral injury is different from PTSD.
All right, so it's important to distinguish moral injury from PTSD. As Cadet Molinar mentioned on the last slide, a moral injury occurs when an individual violates some deeply held moral belief that they have. The results of this can often be things like feelings of guilt and shame for that action that that individual took, and it can manifest itself later on, and things like the individual having an inability to trust others, as well as an internal crisis within that individual who conducted that act. PTSD, on the other hand, affects the psychological aspect of the individual because it is an occurrence that comes as a result of trauma. So it is an individual could experience flashbacks to that traumatic experience and a fear of a reoccurrence of that traumatic experience. Understanding the relationship between moral injury and PTSD is particularly important because an individual could have exclusively moral injury or PTSD, or they could have one which leads to the other later on. And this is important to understand because of the treatment for moral injury and PTSD. The treatment is going to differ between moral injury and PTSD because for moral injury, we need treatment which will address the feelings of guilt that that individual is experiencing, So things like providing the individual with things like talk therapy or the ability to come to peace with that act that they took, as well as opportunities for atonement or forgiveness. A treatment for PTSD, on the other hand, would be slowly helping that individual to dissipate the fear that they feel from that experience and helping them to slowly relive it through exposure therapy, or it could also include things like pharmaceutical drugs, things like that. Additionally, there's a political aspect of this which is important. So there could be an individual who has moral injury but is diagnosed with PTSD, and this really takes away the political nature of moral injury, because moral injury, when looked at from the public and from the political community, could indicate that there are actions taken by the U.S. that possibly have some moral violations, which could bring up interest in U.S. actions abroad. Whereas if you diagnose an individual with moral injury with PTSD, it really just puts them into the category of mental illness and kind of takes away from the political implications of the diagnosis. Additionally, it's important for communities and households and loved ones of individuals who have moral injury to understand the diagnosis, because those are the people who are going to be able to help them with the process of atonement and coming to peace with the actions that they took, by helping them talk through through those experiences. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the influence that moral injury could have on combat readiness. So as I mentioned in the last slide, one of the things that moral injury does is it inhibits the victim's ability to trust others. This is because due to their loss of sight of morals and goodness, they might tend to see others as with evil intention, and expect that others around them might be seeking selfish actions and seeking to exploit them, including their battle buddies within their platoon or their unit. And so as a result of this, the individual could be seeking isolation, and that could really hinder unit cohesion. Additionally, it could hinder the victim's integrity, so it could create a disconnect between the individual's actions as well as their beliefs. So on the one hand, they believe that they have a feeling of guilt within them for some action they commit, but then on the other hand, they're continuing to go into combat and possibly engage in actions that caused that disconnect and that moral injury. Additionally, there can be moral injury can cause a desensitization to morals, basically a loss of a moral compass from that individual. This can result in callous acts and possibly even war crimes if taken serious enough. Finally, it can also hinder the individual's personal belief system. So that loss of that moral compass can cause that individual to maybe give up some religious identity that they had, and that can really hinder the victim's mental state and really leave them combat ineffective. Finally, both PTSD and moral injury can have health effects on the victim. So things like causing stress, which can lead to the victim feeling tired and weak, as well as just hurting the immune and cardiovascular systems of that individual. I'll be followed by Cadet Holman.
So in order for us to propose a plan in dealing with moral injury and PTSD, we need to establish what the status quo is and what exactly we find could be handled better in that system. So as it stands currently, our service members are told the rules of engagement in international law, just strictly on the books, nothing morally. They are given basic resilience, stress, and PTSD training, just basic PowerPoint type stuff. They are given access to chaplain services so that they can facilitate that spiritual component. They are given PDHAs, which is pre and post deployment health assessments, just to ensure that they are combat ready in the most basic mental and physical capacity. They are given access to peer support groups abroad within their unit. Post-deployment, they're given access to a lot of veteran services such as Team Recon and Mission Continues that just support them. And they also have access to resources on military one-source Stockdale. So what exactly is the problem with this system and why we think it's important to distinguish it is because it does not address moral injury at all. And we've already talked about why it's important to be able to distinguish PTSD from moral injury, because their treatments are very, very different. And if you're getting treatment for PTSD, it's not really what you need. At the same time, we don't think that the training that they get for resilient stress and PTSD as it stands, it's not as in-depth or as nuanced as we want. As I said, it's a lot of PowerPoint. It doesn't really facilitate that discussion and that level of minutia and like moral discussion that we really want in our soldiers. In regards to a psychological and medical framework, it's important to note that the medical reference on moral injury is at the Naval Center in San Diego. And what they prescribe there for treating moral injury is a treatment rooted in talk and meditation therapy. So what that essentially proves is that you can talk through your traumatic experience and then reflect upon it, and that is a valid way of beginning to deal with that moral trauma and that moral injury. And the psychological perspective that we're looking at this from is through the cognitive perspective, which dictates that thoughts influence emotions and actions. And one of the core principles of the cognitive perspective is an appraisal. So an appraisal is an individual's initial response to and thoughts about any given stressful situation. There's a primary and a secondary appraisal. So a primary appraisal is how that individual feels the effects of that stress immediately, and the secondary appraisal is how that stress makes the service member feel about their control over their situation. So that is generally the lens that we're going at it with. And we want our soldiers to develop a sort of mindset that is a challenge-oriented mindset, and this facilitates resiliency. So if you go into a situation with this challenge-oriented mindset, it will facilitate more post-traumatic growth than post-traumatic stress. So when an individual experiences post-traumatic growth, they will become more resilient and stronger, and that's also a boon to the people around them, because they see that one of their peers underwent this traumatic experience and became stronger because of it. There's also a spiritual component to this, in that if they tend to lose their purpose because of a moral injury, many religions provide people with that purpose. There's also an 8-step healing process by Brett T. Litz that demonstrates that if a soldier is, or excuse me, a service member is unable to forgive themselves, they can always go about trying to find ways to atone. I'll be followed by Cadet Moore.
So building on these ethical dimensions, we want to talk about some ethical paradigms that we're going to be using in our plan. So first, we want to really bring our service members to more of a moral understanding of the things that they're engaged in during war. And we think that this is really important to prevent disillusionment and cognitive dissonance. So first, we want our service members, rather than feeling really desensitized to emotions and suppressing their emotions and kind of hiding things from them, we want them to kind of understand more of the nuances of the ethical weight in the situations they're dealing with. So instead of glamorizing killing, we want to give our soldiers and service members a real reality check on the weight of the of killing, while also understanding that killing can be necessary and just. And this is really important because our soldiers, without a proper understanding of why they're choosing this action and why we set them up with this moral framework, they're only understanding what to do right now. We see the potential effects of asking soldiers to kind of reflect on the moral framework they're currently using and introduce them to maybe other moral frameworks is going to be a spectrum. So what we kind of want to avoid are the two ends of the spectrum. The first end might be service members that experience feelings of obsessive passivism, where they don't want to engage in killing at all and they think that it can never be necessary and just, and they really feel that they're not able and capable to understand the morality of it. And then the other perspective or other side of the spectrum that we may be facing are soldiers and service members who are completely desensitized to killing, and they're kind of tools that can't use empathy and don't experience any sort of guilt or grief after they've been involved in war. And so we believe that this kind of medium might be calling these service members mindfully detached professionals. So we want our service members to be able to consider the moral weight of the situations they're involved in, and also understand why they're doing certain things and set up their own moral framework that they're comfortable with, and then also be able to reflect on what they did after deployment. But at the same time, we want our soldiers to have some sort of nuanced obedience, and we want them to be squared away and effective at their job. And we believe that it's also important to consider the options of effective coping. And we believe that it's really important to relate this to atonement for some actions that may have been just and necessary, but we still feel some sort of grief. And again, dealing with this in a positive way to improve ourselves. So now we're going to talk about some specific measures and ideas that we want to implement in our platoon to address this higher rate of PTSD and moral injury that we're seeing right now. So first, kind of what we already discussed is providing our service members with some education on different moral frameworks and an underlying moral understanding. So this is kind of going to be an open discussion or discourse that we'd like to engage in with our soldiers, and we'd like to integrate this into our training that we do on effective tactical measures and missions. So this would look like integrating it into our training on different case studies and the dialogue we have after, and also even when we're practicing different missions and having the AARs on those missions, we want to also include this component of open and safe discussion. And then we will also want to support our service members through helping their emotional support base, which may be their family or peers. So we want to also provide some sort of training to the family members of service members in reintegration, and also to kind of supplement that if our service members don't feel very comfortable talking to their family about some of these more morally weighty situations. We want to also give veterans who may want to be engaged in some sort of atonement of their own, we want them to also be able to mentor our soldiers. And then during deployment, we're going to keep with this attitude on reflection and group processing of different missions, and also encouraging our soldiers to be mindful while they're in missions. And finally, when they come back, we want to really encourage them to have the proper resources they need and feel that they have control over their feelings that they are experiencing. So now, Cadet James will take it over with talking about our long-term goals and practical considerations for our plan.
Yeah, so after establishing a means for our new plan at hand, we need to find an end state in order to realize when we've reached our ultimate goal for the new program. And we define this as creating mindfully detached professionals' ability to understand the moral weight behind the task at hand as well. And the main considerations that went into this were the buy-in. In order to reach this understanding of a buy-in, we looked into motivation psychology, which focused on three main values, which are task assessment, values, and mood. Task assessment being understanding the moral weight of the situation and what can occur, that soldiers will and may endure a moral injury, as well as that this can be mitigated through proper understanding of the topic, as well as understanding their own moral malleability. We also looked into the mood. Having a positive outlook on the new training and the purpose at hand plays a large role. Often service members are compounded with death by PowerPoint, and as a result have a negative outlook to what they're about to learn in training already. So with a positive commander and a positive platoon, brigade or fleet outlook on the new mission, it will help with understanding that soldiers get that buy-in. And lastly, the value of the new training. So understanding the moral weight behind the situation and the possibility for moral injury. In addition, we need to look at costs and priorities, right? We don't want to take away from the platoon's effectiveness, and that's why we decided to incorporate this training into platoon missions and platoon AARs. As a result, after a platoon may conduct a raid, they will take a second to take a look back and think about what actions may have resulted in moral injuries and the whole moral weight of the situation as a whole. And in addition, the command climate, focusing on the fact that soldiers need to be responsible stewards of the moral health and take that as their own #1 priority. And lastly, we need to look into risks and objections to our new training program. And these came from allocating resources. So maybe some people may say, we're putting too much focus on the topic of moral injury. And that can be mitigated with buy-in from the soldiers, in addition to emotional openness, ensuring that the platoon has their own moral framework and the ability to place their own moral grounding within the platoon as a whole, instead of focusing on society's approval to get this sense of approval for their actions. And then we looked at the historical comparisons for this. The main one that stood out, the main thing that stood out within the 4 wars was social approval. When a platoon or group, the service members, focuses on society to get that approval, that's where issues arise. Vietnam specifically, where the war was seen as inhumane by the public, and as a result of yellow journalism, such as the Washington Post, barriers of shame affected the platoon negatively, so PTSD that came as a result of the traumatic events that they were a part of was then compounded with moral injury due to the lack of knowledge on the subject. And with our plan, that would have mitigated that because the platoon would have had the emotional openness to discuss these issues as a group, and then they could begin to allot time in making sure that these soldiers are able to cope with the moral injury that they partook in.
All right, I'm sorry, I do have to put you guys off there.
Yeah, we'd like to take questions at this point on any points of clarification, or maybe we can talk more about potential case studies and applications of our plan back to history and to the present.
Okay, I know you're familiar with this quote. Out of every 100 men, 10 shouldn't be there. 80 are targets, 9 do most of the fighting. 1's the warrior that takes them there and back again. Of those 10 people in combat, what are you specifically going to do to prevent moral failure operationally with those 10 who are doing the bulk of the fighting and experiencing the bulk of the trauma?
We actually did, we found a statistic really similar to that. It's a really interesting quote. And we actually found when we were looking into World War II that I think it was only about 20% of the soldiers right on the line fired their weapons. So I think that really kind of relates to that quote. And I guess with our plan, we kind of want to make sure that our whole platoon is getting this training, but to really focus in on those people, we don't feel like they have to be desensitized because they are taking the bulk of this commitment. But we think that maybe that other 90% of service members, they might also feel more comfortable actually doing their job professionally and being effective if they had this training. So do you guys have anything to add? What do you think we could really focus on?
There's also, going back to what we said earlier about talk therapy and dealing with moral injury, the big difference between PTSD and moral injury is moral injury focuses on contextualization. So contextualizing their actions. So the difference between a moral action in combat versus at home, taking the life of someone, contextualizing that within combat and talking about that and making that part of the culture of the platoon is very important to understand that this is within the context of war and just kind of getting that dialogue out there within the platoon.
Building on that, we kind of talked about a group processing model. So if we consider maybe that 10%, or in this example that we use for group processing, so say that there's one person and they, if a child soldier approaches their convoy with explosives and that one person or that 10% engages the target if they don't abide by proper warnings, that other percent would also support this 10% with group processing. So would that look like? That would look like maybe someone who didn't engage the child soldier, they would say, I was prepared to engage them, I would have also engaged them if you hadn't first. I was really afraid in this moment, I was afraid of what was going to happen to my family, thank you so much. And their leaders kind of supported this, so they're kind of getting more of a dialogue.
Essentially, if they're not the active 10%, they can still be a part of the 90%, but then supports the people that are morally injured.
The key is just emotional openness instead of suppressing those emotions.
Okay. Second question, what's the relationship of sleep to moral resiliency, and what specifically will you do as the combat leader to ensure your units and individuals get sleep?
So this is really important that we found with military readiness and how both moral injury and PTSD relate to stress. So stress and the response to stress, our bodies go through kind of a response state and then a state where our bodies have a high amount of cortisol and we're kind of in that maybe fight or flight or high energy situation where we're kind of considering everything, and then our bodies go to exhaustion. And this is really important that our service members are getting sleep, and we encourage them to not only reflect on their day, but also get proper sleep so they can evaluate things and be in their present with a clear mind. And we found that stress that caused lack of sleep related to moral injury and PTSD actually destroyed people's bodies. The high amounts of cortisol decreased their immune systems. It also caused a lot of buildup in arteries that contributed to cardiovascular problems. So soldiers had lower energy and they were actually less effective because of that. So I think health in general and also proper coping mechanisms like doing exercise and working together is really the best way to address maybe sleep deprivation and other bad coping mechanisms that people might use.
I can't speak for the Navy, the Coast Guard, or the Marines, but certainly I know that when cadets are at least out in the field, we look for opportunities to sleep because we don't really have a lot of them. Unfortunately, sometimes patrol bases and missions don't necessarily allow for it. But when you do get that opportunity for sleep, if you are experiencing the effects of trauma and moral injury and PTSD, you don't want the time that you have to be taken up by thoughts about that or being unable to. So at least if you're having these discussions and treating it, at least then you can maximize the time that you have.
Okay, so what I think I heard was intrusive directive leadership and intervention on the leader's part, to mature units.
For sleep? I think maybe we wouldn't kind of force any type of sleep, and we don't really want our soldiers to feel like this program is forced on them. We want them to feel like it's benefiting them and kind of really encouraging them to buy into the value out of it. So I think if we're clear on kind of what they might feel if they don't get sleep and they don't cope with this properly, then it's kind of in their own hands to determine how much sleep they get, if they're comfortable with that, and we can kind of support
Okay.
them
Thank you.
in that.
In dealing with, say, a young man or young woman for that matter that comes back and is diagnosed, so to speak, with moral injury, you came at it seemed to me that you emphasized professional counseling and psychological counseling and that kind of thing. And then you also, down here, you mentioned peer support. Do you consider one any more helpful than the other, or are both of them needed, or what?
I think
What do
the
you
key-
think?
I think the key here was especially the having the idea of emotional openness within the platoon or unit at hand. So the ability for the soldier to reflect, to use the platoon as their own network instead of focusing on whatever society places upon them, allows that person to say, maybe this method of training does not help, or this one helps more than the other. That will allow us to properly allocate those resources and then focus on how can we fix the situation at hand. But at the same time, we don't want to minimize anyone else's moral injury more than the other. And that comes along with the risks and objections for our new proposed method, because that's one of the problems with it at the moment is people don't know what moral injury is versus PTSD. So some people may say it doesn't exist. And then we focus on our motivation psychology, and we focus on buy-in and the task assessment at hand.
Because it's my understanding that soldiers and Marines or people who go into combat, I think generally they're more comfortable talking to their peers about their shared experiences than sitting down with a psychiatrist or psychologist trying to give them, I'm not saying that that's invalid, but, and maybe both of them are needed, but I just wondered what your feeling was on that.
So one aspect of that is like we mentioned about talk therapy and just being able to talk through the events that occur. I think it really goes back to being able to create a dialogue within your platoon and being able to have emotional openness, like they said, where you're comfortable approaching a peer about that, where that's not something that's kind of suppressed instead, you know, that, hey, if you're experiencing that, that's because you're weak or something, but rather creating openness and opportunities for not official talk therapy, not sitting down with a psychiatrist, but if you're not comfortable with that, but just sitting down with somebody in your platoon and being able to talk about that same idea that goes with talk therapy, but with a peer instead.
And we also thought like really encouraging our veterans to kind of get involved with that type of discussion, and maybe a service member might not be even comfortable with their own platoon or a medical profession or their family, and they might be more comfortable talking with someone who has experience or maybe experienced in some PTSD or moral injury themselves.
Yeah.
How did the Army ethic and Army values influence your study?
So in thinking about what we root as as what makes a great soldier, and values like integrity, and then stewardship of the profession. We wanted to focus on making a fine line, right? Because we don't want someone to be a pacifist to the fact that they're mission ineffective, but at the same time, we don't want someone who is a sociopath, right? So we wanted to make sure that these we came up with the term, go back to the slide real quick. We came up with the term mindfully detached professionals, and that is where we said most of the values align with. So can a soldier accomplish the mission at hand, be aware of the action that they are about to partake in, and be accountable for those actions, while still being mission effective and not questioning every action they're about to do. So understanding what is the task at hand, is what is the legality behind it, and what is the reasoning for it. Those are those keys, and those will make sure that the unit as a whole still has that foundation of I can trust the man within my left and right limits, as opposed to saying, this man's crazy, he's just going to kill everybody.
And specific.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.